tonight is a study of decolonisation, of the collapse of European empire, and specifically the collapse of the French and British empires, broadly speaking, in what Eric Hobson used to call the short 20th century. So in that period that begins with the First World War and ends with the fall of the Berlin Wall and broadly the end of the Cold War. In historical terms, it's a study of why the British and French empires collapsed coterminously and in many respects in a very interrelated way. And I suppose one of the key arguments of Fight or Flight is that we can only really understand the collapse of either the British Empire, the French Empire, or indeed the Dutch, Portuguese, and Belgian empires by looking at them in the round and in a more global context. And in many ways, it's a study that's informed not so much by the outside influences of East and West and Cold War tensions, and rather more by the conflicts and tensions that arise between North and South, between rich world and poor world, not just in the years after 1945, but increasingly in the years after the First World War and onwards. The book itself, with its subtitle, Britain, France and Their Roads from Empire, has a certain fixation, I suppose, with why there is such a marked contrast in levels of violence and levels of contestation in the various episodes of decolonisation that it focuses upon. So, for example, in very broad terms, what historians used to refer to as first wave decolonisation, that really overtakes South Asia in the immediate post-Second World War years and then spreads very rapidly into Southeast Asia in the late 1940s and 1950s as well, is, again in rather broad terms, very highly contested and leaves behind it very chaotic and often, in human terms, terribly tragic aftermaths of partition, refugee crises, physical displacement, and unresolved state conflicts over borders, boundaries, belongings and identities in the new countries and the new states that supplant the old British and French presence. As one moves forward into, again, what used to be termed the sort of second wave of decolonisation that is rather more African in focus and that, broadly speaking, begins in earnest in the mid-1950s, although obviously its origins go back much, much further, and then reaches its ultimate peak with the implosion of the Portuguese Empire in the 1970s. There we find that the variations in violence, in contestation, in wars of decolonisation versus what I suppose, to use the subtitle of the book, flight solutions or negotiated solutions, there is much more variation. And I suppose, reflecting on what the book is trying to do as a whole, my central aim is to simply try and tell everybody what I think are the reasons why. Why is there this huge imbalance in contestation and struggle and violence in some instances versus others where the path towards negotiation, relatively peaceful European withdrawal seems more marked.